Nobody told me there was a safe. Not my mother, not my aunts, not the lawyers who spent 3 hours reading a will that said almost nothing. Not even Grandma Loretta herself, who spent the last 6 months of her life in that hospital bed by the window, holding my hand and talking about things I thought were just the rambling of a woman who was tired and ready to go. She talked about the garden. She talked about the summer of 1971. She talked about a man named Thomas Whitfield, who I had never heard of before in my entire 29 years of life. I thought she was confused. I thought the morphine was pulling old dreams up to the surface and presenting them as memories. I smiled and held her hand tighter and told her I loved her, and she looked at me with those dark, steady eyes that never once lost their sharpness, even when the rest of her was giving out, and she said, "Zara, when the time comes, look behind the portrait." I didn't ask which portrait. I assumed she meant something spiritual. I assumed she was telling me to look beyond appearances, to look for something deeper in the family. I was wrong about what she meant. I was wrong about almost everything. The funeral was on a Saturday in November, which felt exactly right because November has always felt to me like the month the world decides to stop pretending. The leaves are already gone, the light comes in low and pale, and doesn't apologize for being insufficient. The ground is hard, and the sky is the color of old pewter. My grandmother, Loretta May Campbell, was 81 years old, and she had lived a life that most people in our family talked about in fragments, the way you describe a painting you've seen only in pieces. She was born in Alabama. She moved north before she was 20. She raised 4 children alone after my grandfather died, or disappeared, depending on which version of the family story you believed. And she built something out of nothing with her hands and her discipline and a stubbornness that I inherited so completely it sometimes feels less like a trait and more like a name. People at the funeral kept saying she was a pillar. They kept saying she was strong. They kept using the word warrior, and I kept standing at the edge of those conversations and thinking that nobody had ever once asked her what the fighting had cost her. My mother, Denise, held it together the way she holds everything together, which is to say she looked composed on the outside and was quietly shattering on the inside. My aunts Rochelle and Patricia argued in low voices about the catering. My cousin Marcus got too close to the open bar too early. I stood near the window of the funeral home and watched the parking lot fill up with people I hadn't seen in years, people who came out of wherever grief summons people from. And I thought about what my grandmother had said about the portrait, and I thought about Thomas Whitfield, and I decided that the moment the last person left my grandmother's house that night, I was going to find out what she had been trying to tell me. The house was on Caldwell Street, a narrow 2-story with green shutters that my grandmother had repainted herself every 3 years without fail until she was 74 and her knees finally filed a formal complaint. I had a key. I'd had a key since I was 16, the year she sat me down at her kitchen table and said that every woman needed at least one place in the world that was unconditionally hers, and she was giving me access to this one. I used to come here after school sometimes, just to sit in the quiet, just to be somewhere that felt like it had already survived everything. After the last of the family peeled away that evening, after the Tupperware lids were snapped shut, and the leftover pound cake was divided, and the long hugs at the door were exchanged, and the last car rolled out of the driveway, I drove back to Caldwell Street alone. My mother thought I'd gone home. My phone was full of messages I wasn't reading. I parked in front of the green shutters and sat in the car for a few minutes in the dark, and then I went inside. The house smelled like her. I don't know how to explain that to someone who hasn't experienced it, the way a dead person's home still carries their scent for days afterward, like the walls are grieving too, like the air hasn't gotten the news yet. I stood in the hallway and breathed it in and let myself cry for the first time that entire day, really cry, the kind that comes from somewhere below language. Then I wiped my face and I turned on the hall light and I went looking for portraits. There were photographs everywhere, framed and clustered on nearly every vertical surface the way my grandmother did everything, thoroughly and without apology. There were school pictures and wedding pictures and a few formal portraits from the 1960s where everyone looked slightly alarmed by the camera. I walked through the living room and into the back hallway and up the stairs, and I was starting to feel foolish, the way you feel when you've taken something metaphorical too literally, when I turned into my grandmother's bedroom and saw it. On the wall above the small writing desk she kept in the corner was a portrait I had looked at 100 times without really seeing it. It was an oil painting, not large, in a heavy dark frame, depicting a woman I had always assumed was some distant relative. The woman in the portrait was seated and composed and wearing a white blouse with a high collar, and she looked directly out of the frame with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was not far from one. I had always thought the woman looked a little like my grandmother. I had never thought to ask who she was. I lifted the portrait off the wall. My hands were steadier than I expected. Behind it, mounted flush into the wall, painted the same off-white as the surrounding plaster so that you would never notice it unless you were looking, was a small steel safe. A dial safe, old-fashioned, with a black handle, and the kind of combination mechanism that looks like something from a different century. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I thought about every birthday she had given me, every graduation card, every letter she had ever sent in her careful, upright handwriting, and I thought about the number she always used for important things. Her mother's birth year, 1919. I turned the dial. It didn't open. I tried her own birth year, 1942. Nothing. I tried the year she moved north, which according to family lore was 1963. The handle turned, the door swung open. Inside the safe there were 3 things: an envelope, a photograph, and a small velvet pouch that clinked softly when I lifted it. I sat down on the edge of my grandmother's bed. The bed I was not sure anyone had slept in since she'd been moved to the hospital, still made with the same quilted coverlet in deep burgundy and cream that I had been looking at my whole life. And I opened the envelope first because I was my grandmother's granddaughter and she had taught me to read before I touched anything else. The letter was handwritten. The handwriting was not my grandmother's. It was masculine and slightly slanted and very deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned penmanship as a formal skill and never lost it. It was dated June 14th, 1971. It began, "My darling Loretta." And then everything I thought I knew about my family history began to quietly rearrange itself. The man who had written the letter was Thomas Whitfield, not a figment of morphine-softened memory. A real man with real handwriting who had called my grandmother "my darling" in June of 1971 and had written 4 pages that I read 3 times sitting alone in her bedroom while the November night pressed itself against the windows. Thomas Whitfield was white. I understood this from context before anything confirmed it, from the way he wrote about what he called the situation, from the way he referenced her family's concerns and his family's expectations as separate and unnavigable geographies, from the way he wrote about a decision that had already been made, a decision he described as the only one that allowed us both to survive what was coming, and from the way the letter ended not with goodbye, but with something more final and more tender than goodbye, something that landed in my chest with a weight I am still carrying. He wrote about a child. He wrote about arrangements he had made and money he had set aside and a promise he intended to keep regardless of what the world chose to allow him. He used the word ours once in a sentence that I had to read 4 times before I understood what it was telling me. I opened the photograph next. It was black and white, slightly faded at the edges, the kind of photograph from an era when photographs were saved for significant things. In it stood my grandmother, young, 21, the age when her cheekbones were a declaration and her eyes held something the years would eventually teach her to conceal. She was standing beside a man who was tall and fair-haired and looking at her with an expression that required absolutely no interpretation. And between them, held in the crook of my grandmother's arm, was an infant, wrapped in a white blanket, eyes closed, not more than a few weeks old. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, was a single line. Thomas, Loretta, and baby James, April 1971. Baby James. My Uncle James, who I had grown up knowing as the quiet one, the serious one, the one who never quite fit the family mold, and who had moved to Portland in his 30s and visited at Christmas with a politeness that always felt like it was covering something. Uncle James, who had my grandmother's eyes and something else in his face that I had never thought to name. Uncle James, who was born in 1971. I opened the velvet pouch last. Inside were two things: a folded document that turned out to be a deed to a property in a county I didn't recognize, and a key. A small brass key with a tag attached to it that read, in my grandmother's handwriting, First National, Box 447. I sat in that bedroom for a long time. The heat clicked on, and the furnace breathed, and the house settled around me the way old houses do when they're getting ready to hold a secret. I looked at the letter and the photograph and the deed and the key, and I thought about my grandmother holding my hand in that hospital room, choosing that moment and those words because she knew there would be no other moment. And I understood for the first time what it costs to carry something enormous and private for more than 50 years. I understood that she had built her whole life on top of a story she could never tell, and that she had spent 50 years making sure that when the time came, the truth would have a door to walk through. She had put it behind the portrait. She had put it behind the woman who looked like her. She had put it behind her own face. What I did next is the part people always ask about when I tell this story, and it is also the part I am most uncertain about, even now. I called my mother. I know. It was 11 o'clock at night. I know. She had just buried her mother 8 hours ago. I know all of that, and I called her anyway, because some things cannot wait, and some things cannot be carried alone. And because the woman who raised me deserved to know what was in that safe before I knew what to do with it. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Zara, are you all right?" And I said, "Mom, were you close with Uncle James when you were growing up?" There was a pause, a long one. And she said, in a voice that had shifted into something careful and old, "Why are you asking me that?" The conversation lasted 2 hours. I stayed in my grandmother's bedroom the whole time, sitting on the quilted coverlet, the letter and the photograph spread across the bed beside me. My mother cried, not the composed internal shattering of the funeral home, but something rawer and older, the kind of crying that has been waiting a long time for permission. She told me things she had always known and never said. She told me that she had noticed, as a child, that Uncle James was different. Not badly, not in a way that troubled her, but in a way that nobody ever explained. She told me that there had been a man, someone she had understood as a child to be a family friend, who sent money every year at Christmas in an envelope addressed only to her mother. She told me that her mother had never dated, never remarried, had deflected every question about her romantic history with a composure that my mother had always read as grief, but now understood might have been something more complicated. She told me she had felt something unspoken in the family her whole life, the way you feel a current in still water, and she had never known what it was. Now she knew. We agreed to say nothing to anyone until we had spoken to Uncle James. This required both of us to sit with something enormous in the silence between us and everyone else in the family, which is one of the hardest things human beings are asked to do. I drove home from Caldwell Street at 2 a.m. with the letter and the photograph and the velvet pouch in a paper bag on my passenger seat, and I lay in bed for the rest of the night in that particular kind of sleeplessness where your mind is moving so fast that consciousness can't keep pace with it, where you keep touching the edges of something so large you can't find the shape of it in the dark. I flew to Portland 4 days later. I did not tell Uncle James I was coming until I was already at the airport, because I did not trust myself to manage his questions over the phone, and because I thought, I still think, that what I was carrying required a room, required chairs, required the possibility of silence without the pressure of a telephone connection. He met me at the door of his apartment with an expression that I recognized as the one he always wore at Christmas, the careful covering politeness. He had gotten older since I'd seen him last. His hair was mostly gray, and he was thinner than I remembered, and there was something about him in that doorway, something in the set of his shoulders, that looked like a man who had been expecting a particular knock for a very long time, and had made a private peace with the possibility that it might never come. I showed him the letter first. He read it standing in his hallway with his coat still on, and I watched his face the way you watch a landscape when the weather is changing, and what I saw there was not surprise. It was recognition. It was the particular, exhausted recognition of someone confronting something they have always known in the body but never been given words for. He sat down slowly in the chair nearest the door, still in his coat, the letter in his hands, and he said without looking up, "She told you." And I said, "She left me the way to find out." And he said very quietly, "She always did things the elegant way." What followed was a conversation I am not going to reproduce in full, because some of it belongs to him, and I am not the right person to tell all of it. What I will say is this. He knew. Not the specifics, not the letter, not the name Thomas Whitfield spoken aloud by anyone who could confirm it, but the shape of it, the contour of the secret, the gravitational pull of the thing that had been left unspoken in the center of his whole life. He had figured it out in his 30s, he said, in the way that adult children often figure out family secrets, through an accumulation of small observations that finally assemble themselves into a pattern you can't unsee. A document in a drawer, the way a family friend watched him at family events, the way his mother sometimes looked at him with an expression that contained something besides love. Not instead of love, alongside it, layered beneath it, something that looked like apology. He had never asked her. He told me this with a directness that I found both painful and completely understandable. He had never asked her because he had understood without anyone explaining it, that asking would require her to reopen something that she had sealed over with 50 years of living, and he loved her too much to demand that of her. And so they had carried it together, separately, each pretending not to know what the other knew, across decades and holidays and phone calls and hospital visits, until she had decided that the time had come to hand it to someone who could finally put it down. I stayed in Portland for 3 days. By the end of the first day, we had opened a bottle of wine that was probably too good for the occasion and too necessary not to open, and we had begun to talk about Thomas Whitfield in the way you talk about someone who is gone, but still present, which is to say we talked about him carefully and with increasing curiosity, and with the strange tenderness you feel towards someone who shaped your life without ever entering it. He had died in 1989. Uncle James had found this out on his own, years ago. He had a family, legitimate and separate and entirely unaware of Caldwell Street. He had kept the promise in the letter, the money at Christmas, but he had kept it silently and at a distance, which is the only way it could have been kept in that time and in that world. The property deed in the velvet pouch turned out to be something neither of us had anticipated. The county we hadn't recognized was in Virginia. The property was 40 acres of land on the outskirts of a small town, purchased in 1972 and held in a trust that had been quietly managed by a law firm for 50 years, with taxes paid and title maintained and no instructions attached about what to do with it except the instruction that it should pass to James Campbell upon the death of Loretta May Campbell, which had now occurred. The land was not worthless. The land, as we discovered when we finally retained our own attorney and began asking questions, was far from worthless. The area had been developing for a decade. The 40 acres were worth something that I am not going to put a number on here, because the number is not the point, and the number changes what people think the story is about, and this story is not about money. What it is about is this: a woman who lived an entire interior life in parallel to the life everyone could see, who loved in circumstances that demanded concealment, who made decisions under pressures that no one should ever have to carry alone, who spent 50 years protecting people she loved from a truth that might have broken things she didn't want broken, and who, in the end, trusted one person to open the safe and begin the process of making it whole. she trusted me. Not my mother, though my mother had been beside her longer. Not Uncle James, who deserved it most, but whose grief she had wanted someone else to cushion. She trusted me, the one who asks too many questions and holds on to things too long and cannot leave a mystery alone. She trusted me because she knew I would not flinch. She was right. I flinched, but I didn't stop moving. The bank box was the last piece. First National turned out to be a regional bank with a branch about 12 minutes from Caldwell Street, and the branch manager was a woman named Claudette Harmon, who was young enough that she'd needed to call in her supervisor to deal with the paperwork of a deceased account holder's lockbox, but who handled the whole thing with a professionalism and a gentleness that I was not expecting from a Tuesday morning in November. Uncle James had flown in from Portland by then. My mother came too. We stood in a small room off the main floor of the bank, the three of us, around a rectangular metal box that the branch manager had unlocked and left with us, and nobody opened it immediately. We stood with it closed between us for a moment that felt longer than it was, the way certain moments do when you understand you are inside something irreversible. My mother opened it. She is the oldest. She lifted the lid and looked inside, and she went very still, and then she reached in and lifted out what was there. More letters. 47 of them, bundled with a ribbon that had once been red and had faded to something closer to rose. All written in that same masculine, careful handwriting. All addressed to my darling Loretta. Spanning from 1963 to 1988, the year before he died, one every year, sometimes two, charting the entire invisible arc of something that had no sanctioned name in the world it was born into and had survived anyway, stubbornly and quietly, for 25 years, through marriages and moves and children and loss and the particular ongoing grief of proximity without presence. At the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, was one more thing. A photograph, this one in color, taken sometime in the 80s based on the quality and the clothes. In it was Thomas Whitfield, older, silver-haired, standing in what appeared to be a garden somewhere. He was looking off to the side, not at the camera, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who is somewhere they are content to be. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, T.W., 1985, he sent this. I kept it. She kept it. For 40 years. In a bank box with 47 letters and a brass key, she kept a photograph of a man looking happy somewhere that wasn't with her, and she put it at the bottom of everything, beneath all the words he had sent her. And she kept it because it was all she had, and because she was Loretta Mae Campbell, and she kept what mattered. We read some of the letters that afternoon, there in the bank room with the door closed. Not all of them. That would have taken days, and some of them we understood were not ours to read, not yet, maybe not ever, maybe only Uncle James's to read in his own time and at his own pace. But some of them we read together, my mother and my uncle and I, passing them around that small table, and I want to tell you what it felt like because I think it is important, and I think it is something that often gets left out of these stories. It felt like meeting someone, not a ghost, not a revelation, a person. A real, flawed, limited, loving, cowardly, brave, complicated person who had been present in my family's life in ways nobody could acknowledge, whose choices had shaped things none of us had understood, and who was now, 50 years after the fact, in a room with the people those choices had created. We could not be angry at him. We could not be entirely forgiving of him either. He had done what he could in the container of who he was and when he was, and that container had real dimensions and real limits. And the woman on Caldwell Street had understood those limits and had loved him anyway, and had built a life that did not wait for his limits to expand. She had not waited. She had lived. She had been magnificent. That evening, the three of us went back to Caldwell Street, and we cooked dinner together in my grandmother's kitchen. My mother found a pot of dried red beans she'd brought, which in our family is the culinary equivalent of raising a flag. Uncle James, who turned out to have opinions about seasoning that were deeply and unapologetically his own, contributed something to the pot that I will not describe in detail because my mother would object to it being documented, though for what it's worth the beans were extraordinary. We ate at the kitchen table where my grandmother had served hundreds of meals, and we talked, not about Thomas Whitfield, not that night, we had said enough for one day, but about her, about Loretta. About the woman who had had the audacity to love fully in a world designed to make that impossible for her, who had kept her own counsel so completely that the people closest to her had spent their lives feeling the warmth of her fire without ever quite seeing the source of it, who had left behind a safe and a portrait and a brass key because she believed correctly that the truth is not a burden but a gift, and that the only question is when to give it. I have been asked, since this happened, whether I think she should have told us sooner, whether Uncle James deserved to know earlier, whether the secret was a cruelty dressed as protection. I have thought about this more than I can articulate, and my answer, which I hold loosely and am willing to revise, is this. She was managing forces none of us had to manage. She was navigating a world that was not interested in her navigation. She made decisions in real time, without the benefit of hindsight or distance or the luxury of being wrong without consequence. And those decisions held. The family held. Uncle James held. The love held. What more can you ask of a person than that what they built holds? The 40 acres in Virginia are in the process of being transferred to Uncle James now. He has not decided what to do with them, and I do not think he needs to decide quickly. The letters are in a box at his apartment in Portland. The photograph of Thomas Whitfield in the garden is there too. The portrait of the woman who looks like my grandmother is still on the wall above the writing desk in the bedroom on Caldwell Street, which my mother has decided she is not ready to sell yet, and which I visit sometimes on Saturdays in a habit I did not plan to form and do not want to break. The safe is still in the wall. I leave it open now. It seems right. What changed after the funeral was not the facts. The facts were always there, waiting in the dark behind the portrait, waiting in the bank box with the faded ribbon and the 47 letters. What changed was the shape of the family. What changed was what I understood about silence and what it protects and what it costs. What changed was my relationship with my grandmother, which you might think would be impossible since she was gone. But grief is strange, and love is stranger. And I find that I know her better now than I did when she was living, now that I have read what she kept and seen what she saved and understood the architecture of the life she built in the space between what was possible and what she would not agree to give up. I know her as a full person, complex and contradicted, and brave and afraid and in love for 25 years with someone the world would not make room for, building something real out of the materials the world agreed to give her. She was 81 years old, and she kept a photograph for 40 years, and she painted the shutters green every 3 years, and she raised 4 children, and she gave me a key when I was 16, and told me every woman needed a place that was unconditionally hers. She was telling me, even then, what she knew from the inside. She was giving me what she wished someone had given her, back in 1963, back when she was 21, and in love and standing at the edge of a world that had already decided what she was allowed to want. I kept the key she gave me at 16. I have it on the same ring as my car keys. I have had it for 13 years. I will keep it for the rest of my life. Not because I need access to Caldwell Street, though I do, not because it is a practical object, though it is, but because it is the first thing she gave me that I now understand fully. And because understanding the gifts of the dead is one of the stranger and more beautiful things that grief makes possible. You spend your whole life receiving what someone has to give you, and then they are gone, and the giving continues, because the things they left behind are still speaking, still reaching forward through time, still trying to say the thing they could not quite say while they were standing in the room with you. She said, "Look behind the portrait." She meant, "I saved something for you." She meant, "When the time comes, you will be ready." She meant, "I trust you with the true version of my life." She meant, "This is not the end. This is the part where it becomes whole." If you are watching this and you have a story in your family that nobody talks about, a closed door, a name that changes the temperature of the room, a photograph you were never meant to find, I want you to sit with it. I want you to consider that the people who sealed those doors loved fiercely under conditions we cannot fully imagine, and that the ceiling was sometimes also a kind of shelter, and that opening those doors, when the time comes, is not a betrayal, but a completion. Your job is not to judge the people who came before you. Your job is to receive what they saved, to understand the weight of it, and to carry it forward with the care it deserves. My grandmother opened a door for me. I am walking through it. That is the whole story. That is the story that doesn't end. If this meant something to you, if it touched something in your own family history or in your own understanding of the people who made you, I want you to tell me in the comments. Tell me about the safe in your family. Tell me about the portrait on the wall. Tell me what you found, or what you're afraid to look for, or what you already know and haven't yet said out loud. I read every comment. I keep them the way my grandmother kept letters, and if you are new here and you found this today, welcome. Subscribe. There is more of this. There is always more of this, because families are the longest stories any of us will ever tell, and the most important ones almost never start at the beginning. Like this, if Loretta deserved to be known. She did. She absolutely did.